don't know that either of us needs any introduction. This is week 10 of our weekly series, and we're going into syndication now. I do anticipate perhaps a bit of a hiatus where we don't have enough new information to take up everyone's time, but we are setting up a number of services to keep answering questions and keep troubleshooting for you. So maybe while we're waiting for the slides, I'll just, I do want to not cut short the traditional land acknowledgement. I am in downtown Toronto this evening, and that means that we are broadcasting on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. The city also acknowledges that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas. And
here it is. Live now. Got it.
Okay.
So, folks,
Give me just a second here.
No problem.
Participant screen back, and I'm going to just mute everybody except Eric.
20 second delay between.
Okay, Eric, you should be
just
good to go.
Paul's name for Woodford.
So, oops, give me just a second here. Participant screen back, and I'm going to unmute. Oh. Eric, we're both pushing the button at the same time. Eric, you go ahead and unmute yourself. Eric,
Okay.
Clyde, can do
There
that.
we go.
Okay, I am feeling a little calmer now, and I think we're all set to go. And I've got everybody's mics off except for our presenters. So I do apologize for the delay and the complications here. I kept trying to stream to YouTube, and it kept sending it to my own personal channel instead of the United Church's channel, and nobody was watching there. Anyway, thank you, Eric, for introducing the land acknowledgement, and I think we're good to go. So why don't you take it away here?
Okay, great. Thank you, sir. If you can pull up the slides. Longtime viewers will know that the first slide is just a title slide, and we move right to the new creed. I start every finance webinar or presentation with this because we are not alone through all of this, and thanks be to God. So next slide, please. This webinar has been designed to be the last one for a while. Okay, so what that means is we are going to recap relatively quickly a number of these items, but the latest news, the 75% subsidy, the CEWS as it's called, it is extended, but there's still no new information on whether any of the rules will change or just how that will work. The rent program portal opened this week, and I'll be showing you how it works. And we're also announcing a help desk function with Clyde and two of my key national finance team folks, Rose Camborne and Carla Hacker, who are going to be available to troubleshoot with you, trying to get basically signed up with CRA. So we're going to go do a quick recap of various programs. We still get a lot of questions on how the 10% interplays with the 75%, and of course your questions. So I apologize for the late start. I will try to make up a little time during the program, and at the same time, obviously try to be responsive to your questions. Okay, next slide, please. So this is reminders. The churches, outreach ministries, people who own a building or are a landlord are eligible for the rent program. That was up in the air for a long time. Kendra told us about it last week, And frankly, it was changing last Wednesday night and being refined. So I've got some new information for you there. We still are not eligible for the $40,000 loan program, the CEBA. Our camps are, for example, but there are a number of you out there with who have got loans. I wouldn't give them back quite yet. And I just want to flag insurance premiums is not just the national program. The national program's been quite level for I guess about 3 years, and the premiums are spiking. But I'm hearing from all the other, I'm hearing from United Church congregations who aren't with the UCC Protect program, and they're getting, in some cases, even larger increases, but increases in that magnitude as well. The industry is going nuts. Got a couple of filing reminders there, but particularly on the church statistics, if Susan Jackson were hundreds behind the normal timing here, and I appreciate we're all distracted with trying to just make payroll, but if you could attend to the annual church statistics submission, that would be appreciated. Next slide, please. So the federal program, I've just got one slide here as we're recapping. The 10%, we go and get it. You literally do a calculation, you send it to your payroll provider who happens to be ADP. The 75%, now we know you have to, first of all, see if you're eligible, and then you have to apply for it. And the challenge, of course, for many of us has been that all the ways to do this are electronic, and not all of us are quite set up to do that yet. Next slide, please. So this is a quick recap. Again, the loan program, still not eligible. This explains why, and the whole idea is this for this to be in the deck because we think we're moving off weekly webinars for a time. So this is going to be a current snapshot of all the things a church treasurer or a congregation should be considering. Okay, next slide. Similarly, the CERB, there's nothing new in it other than, they've tried to keep being flexible and opening it up, allowing some income and so on. But the purpose of this slide is to offer a relatively full snapshot of things. Next slide. Again, we've talked a little bit about layoffs. If you are considering it, then it's really important to check with your region to make sure that you're up on the any provincial requirements or provincial programs. There are various incentives provincially as well, but a key element here is trying to do a record of employment electronically, and Clyde has a webinar on the United Learning site for you on that. Next slide. The United Church Loan Program, I've said thank you to the foundation, and I'll keep saying thank you to the foundation. That's the initial money. I'm still in the stages of negotiating loan programs for being able to respond longer, but the initial funding comes from the foundation. The program is at present $10,000 loans, and the idea is that some of that would kick in potentially after these government programs wind up. For those of you in unusual circumstances, you might need or want to be applying now. I think we've issued something in the magnitude of 20 or 30 of those already. Next slide. The next slide is just recaps that it's $10,000. There's a forgivable grant element to it if it's repaid in full. Right now, that date is September 30th, 2021. We talk about terms. Please understand, again, as I've said many times, all of this is at a point in time. This is what we're imagining right now. We could extend the interest-free period with the stroke of a pen. And frankly, we've seen the government do that on a host of programs that they've changed things. Next slide, please. So internal governance, wage or rental subsidy applications do not require regional approval. They're local paperwork. A loan application should have a congregation approval. if there are forms, it's usually the trustees that sign, but according to the manual, it's the congregation that approves. I want to stress that I'm saying for the rental subsidy, the CECRA program, it's a forgivable loan. So you really should think of it as a grant as opposed to a loan that needs regional approval. The only way you're not going to get that forgiven is if you're not eligible in the first place. So there's no point in slowing things down there. Next slide. So this is a bit of now new stuff based on, just last Wednesday, we learned that we were eligible for sure, and that the T3010 was an annual filing, and that the rent program, that we were eligible, and it's forgivable loans to eligible property owners, including churches. The whole idea, though, is to reduce the rent owed by small business tenants and help them meet program expenses. So the whole idea was that the property owners must offer a minimum of a 75% rent reduction for the 3 months, April, May, and June. Obviously, you can do some of this after the fact. You can issue it as credits. If you have forgiven rent or if you haven't collected rent, as long as you're meeting the spirit of the program, there's a lot of latitude in how you do it. You might issue refunds if you've collected rent. You might issue a credit for future months, and it should be agreed with your tenant. There's a lot of good information and forms at this web link. Next slide, please. So landlord eligibility, you must have a legal rental or lease agreement. You must have declared rental income, and originally it said on their 2018 and 2019 tax returns, T3010 returns. There is an opportunity to make a special case if you're a new entity. Clyde and I have had some dealings with an outfit that just took this on at the beginning of 2019. What we're suggesting there is immediately file your T3010, so there's a history of, there's demonstrated rental income, or concurrently file, because you're meeting every aspect of the spirit of the program. It's no longer a requirement to have a mortgage, even though that was the original design that was basically locking out nonprofits and charities. Next slide, please. Okay, a tenant needs to have had a 70% reduction in income compared to last year or to the Jan-Feb, the same way, all these other income tests are measured. I don't think we care about the next two things. If you've got 50,000 a month tenants, then you're probably doing okay. The one little wrinkle that Kendra shared with me today is the fact that if you have a tenant who doesn't have a corporate business number or a charity number, but is operating as a sole proprietor, you literally need to get their social insurance number as part of the work. And it is the landlord that assembles the paperwork. So, basically, even though that's typically pretty confidential information, if you need to say, if you want me to get this for you, and I want to get this for you, then we have to work together on the paperwork. Next slide. So I stress here, it's the landlord that needs to gather the proofs. The tenant reduction in revenue, you're going to have to take that at face value. If you're a closed daycare or a closed school or anything like that, that won't be too difficult to prove. But the tenant signs an attestation, and so does the landlord. So there's a lot of good faith built into this. They aren't going to ask you to send in your financial statements to prove this. The application launched on Monday, and you need to register first. And I'm going to take you through the registration process. The good news is, if you're in this boat, frankly, if you're in this boat, you've probably already done it, because no one's registered with the CMHC until now. So the process will work for everybody. Next slide, please. And so again, this may be why Ray, no, Tuesday, if he applied yesterday, it says Ontario, but they're expecting a busy time, and so they were staggering the applicants. You may recall they did this with some of the earlier programs, but it could be that they aren't quite as fast out of the gate as the CRA was in terms of pumping out checks and approving things. So there's the schedule here, which is when you should register. Register is not the same as apply. Next slide, please. So the first step on the registration, you basically tick 3, this is right from the form, these are screenshots. You basically tick 3 boxes. You tick a box that says you have rental income. You tick a box that says you have small tenants that are eligible. And there's a few things you have to say you're not. Please confirm that the property owner is not. And let me say, if you can't read the small print or anything, again, I've tried to offer this as much for the slides later, but you're literally ticking 3 boxes saying you're eligible, and you're confirming at the bottom that you won't give out your username and password to other parties, and you'll do confidentiality and stuff. Pretty normal government or anywhere else things. But the first step is literally ticking 3 boxes, as you can see here. The next step, on the next slide, is there's a whole bunch, there's a list of 10 things that around what you promise to adhere to. And there's, I just put the last one here, headings for convenience only. So there's things around the use and disclosure of information. You're just promising to be confidential. They're stressing that it's proprietary. You're releasing them. Basically, it's a bunch of stuff lawyers came up with. The only thing that they're suggesting in here that you should care about is don't lie to us. That's really it. Then you click on I agree, which is just by Clyde's head on my screen. And then we go to the next step, where you just provide a bit of information, your first name, your last name, your birth date, your mobile phone number. So whoever's doing this, the way they set it up, it needs to have a mobile phone number. Again, we're going full speed into an electronic world. The address for service is going to be where they contact you, and presumably it could be the, where you're renting. And again, you'll end up clicking on I'm not a robot and all that kind of stuff. But basically you put in that information. Again, this is about as friendly as it gets. And you will, I think you get a confirmation right away. I think someone got a confirmation that they received it. At least one person has mentioned to me that I think it was Ray, that the username hasn't yet been emailed or the password texted. I haven't heard that the system is delayed. I wouldn't be surprised if they were a bit swamped. But the idea is if you've done your work, then you get a confirmation, and you should get a username by email and a password texted to you, what's called two-step authentication. And once you've done that, next slide, please, you'll have your codes to go into the application form. And this now takes you through who pays what on the program. Kendra took us through this last week, but the whole idea is that the tenants potentially pay 25%. They might not. You might choose to forgive 25%. But the idea is that the provincial governments, this is why it took so long to negotiate, because it was federal and provincial, will pay 50% to you. You're, as a landlord, accepting a 50%, or I'm sorry, a 25% loss. And then whatever the tenant pays is what you negotiate. Again, it depends what your circumstances are. Lots of folks haven't collected rent over this period. If you haven't collected rent, you're still applying, and your paperwork is basically promising the government how you're going to share it, that you will be forgiving literally 75% of the rent for the small business tenant. Next slide. So that is the rental program. I thought we'd take a quick stop there in case there were specific questions about the rental program. We will, of course, move on to the wage subsidies and go give you the most recent information on that as well. So I'm just going to have a quick look at the chat box myself.
Haven't seen a whole lot of sort of general interest come in on the chat box. There's been a couple of specific questions, Clyde, that you've responded to. Is there anything you want to say about those that that would be of general interest to more than the one person you responded to?
Yeah, I will comment on the CECRA. Eric mentioned that if you haven't been already filed your 2019 T3010 to get it done, don't do it by paper. Do it online, because online it's done immediately when you press the submit button. It's into their system. If it's on paper, we don't know how long that's going to take to actually filter through. So if you want it there to verify some of the information you're given under CECRA, online is the best way to do it.
Good, thank you. Otherwise, I'm not seeing a lot coming up, even on the YouTube chat. Maybe we lost a few people with all of our technical difficulties at the beginning, so our audience may be smaller. I can't tell with the setup. But I think you could probably go on, Eric.
Okay, in that case, please do. And I will try to make this screen go away.
Oh, there we go. How do rentals for weddings, funerals, and service groups tie into this? Says somebody from YouTube.
Sure. Well, and they don't. A key requirement here is the existence of actual lease agreements. More casual or one-off arrangements won't be picked up here. The fact that a wedding, is canceled is a modest revenue hit to the church, but it's way more disruptive to the family.
And let me push that just a little bit to be sure. I asked this question last week, but in the congregation I serve, we have a fairly extensive agreement with a Pentecostal congregation, which lays out which rooms they're allowed to use on which days of the week. Is that considered a lease, or is that just where does that kind of thing fall? They don't have exclusive use space, but they do have a very, very clearly written legal agreement.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first test, of course, is that they would have to demonstrate a 70% loss in revenue. Sure. If they did, I think I actually think you could give it a go. It's a legal, a well-defined regular use legal document.
Okay.
But the first test, and that'll be a challenge in most cases, will be the 70% revenue loss, unless you are a daycare or a school or something. I would assume that a Pentecostal church or any other church would have some par revenue and those kinds of things, just like us.
I hope their revenue is coming in just like ours are. We've got some questions coming in now, so let's back up to the question slide, and then we'll look at these. So Grant says, I note we're not permitted to agree with the tenant that they'll pay us back later for the 25% it costs the church. In other words, we really are waiving that.
No, absolutely. There's absolutely no question here. The whole idea is that you're still getting half the rent, but this program is not targeted to make the church whole. This program is targeted to help your tenants survive and continue to pay you rent when we come out the other side of this.
Okay. And I'm looking at this question from Josie on YouTube. It looks to me like she says, what happens when the landlord is the church, but it doesn't own the property? So the church itself, I guess, is a tenant, and then it's subleasing portions to somebody else.
Well, again, you get into it is intended to be the landlord, the taxpayer, or of course we have a tax exemption. But I don't believe it's going to cover sublet arrangements. We do have a number of churches that rent space and then sublet. My understanding is that won't be covered. If someone wanted to send an email to me on their specific circumstance, frankly, I'll have Kendra look at it in more detail.
Okay. Next question. Jim Patterson already made an agreement with one of his tenants to reduce the rent by 2/3. Can he go back and revise that and reduce it by 75% now? Now that he knows that they're eligible for this program?
Not only, he actually must to qualify for the program.
Sure, but having made the agreement doesn't preclude him from applying. He just has to revise his agreement.
Yeah, at the end of the day, you need to attest that you've delivered to the specifications of the program. The fact that you're going to deliver a bit more than you've already contracted to, it just means you're better off.
Sure. Great.
Yeah,
Not
what,
saying-
one other clarification on there too. The 25% that's to be paid by the tenant, that's a maximum amount. You can negotiate anywhere from 0 to 25%.
That's important, and I didn't understand that originally. So that was news to me last week, and is really helpful in my congregation situation too. We have a daycare that has 0 income. They couldn't pay the 25%. I thought when I first heard of the program that it would knock us out of applying, and it's good to know that it doesn't.
No, it does not.
However,
Okay.
however, that is in the landlord's discretion. So,
Yes.
I mean, as a church, I would expect us to try to be supportive, because it's tough to get good tenants. So if you've got good tenants, it's in your long-term interest to get them back in when it's safe.
Well, and as Kendra said last week, right now we're getting nothing. So even getting half of it would be better than nothing.
Right on.
Okay, those
Okay,
are all the questions I'm seeing, guys. So
great. Okay.
let me move you back to the 10% slide here.
Yeah. So again, the 10% is a recap, and a couple of things. This will drive some of you crazy. You get to take it off payrolls that are run between these dates, March 18th. So if you had a March 15th payroll, that wasn't eligible. That basically means that your first draw is going to be in April, your next draw is going to be in May, and your next draw is going to be in June. And however long it takes you to get your 10% entitlement, it is what it is. And when I say church, this is also true for our outreach ministries, our camps, and so on. Again, we have about 1,300 pastoral charges, which is something like 75 or 80, even more, 80%. Having ADP do this with the supervision of our payroll team. So the initial payments are arriving now, and the next batch is going to be done at the end of May once they complete the regular cycle. And then again, if you're having to do this yourself because you have folks not on ADP, the temporary wage subsidy worksheet and the form that you have to submit to ADP, or presumably if you have another provider, those are all available online. Next slide, please. So a few things that we've updated. It wasn't very clear online. I rushed some stuff up there without even putting names on it. So on the the payroll service team website, where there's all kinds of other information, we now have the list of, whatever, I think it's about 1,070 or so that are batch A that requested this service from April 8th to 24th. We have batch B, which was last week's special offer to sign up more people. Those lists are online with those names. And in addition, we've got a list of about 115 or so that errored out in the computer run and are being fixed individually. So there's quite a number. In those cases, I've spoken to a couple of you today already where you're on the exception list. I can tell you what your amount was and so on. But again, I want to stress, whether you're doing this yourself or whether you're having ADP do it for you, you're throwing new and unique transactions into a system that is maximum stressed. It's not just us, it's ADP, it's every other payroll provider. And so we do ask your patience. If you're on the list, it'll get looked after. Next slide.
So just before you go from there, there's one church that was on the list for April. They're wondering whether that means that they'll get it for March too.
It depends where their payroll was in March. Again, if your payroll happened to be March 15th, then you weren't eligible in March. It's literally driven by when your payroll run was. And I'll get into this in just a second on the next slide.
But even if they were in batch B, I guess is the question, would batch B have been processed all the way back to the first eligible payroll?
Yes, everything gets processed back. If you're doing it yourself, you have to go back to you have to go to see what you're eligible for. And then the current income tax buckets are what you have to draw from. So the fact that you've just signed up now, for example, it might take 3 months to use up the income tax bucket to claim this amount. Next slide, please.
Okay.
And so again, this is a slide that my regulars will know well. If you've got one staff person, might be a minister making $5,000 a month, the income tax would be something like $1,200. The eligible subsidy is $1,375. That's the maximum per individual. It means you're going to take 3 months to get that, because in this simple example, it's 10% of monthly wages that is the maximum that can be taken from the income tax bucket. Next slide. Adding a couple of employees, and this program is attractive because you can claim 10% of your payroll if you have a lot of sort of part-time roles, as many churches might have. If they're on payroll, you have a chance to claim larger, up to $1,375, depending on how big your income tax bucket is. So in this case, we have a couple of people that are making $1,000 a month. They bump up your entitlement here to $2,100. Again, it'll take at least 3 months of dipping into the income tax bucket to get your money. Next slide. So here's an example of a specific case. And there's no, it's the regular wages. There was that goofy little taxable benefit of the life insurance. This has a phone benefit on here as well. If there was a learning benefit or something, it would be on here as well. But basically, you're seeing an income amount of $5,600. 10% of that is $566. But depending on what the timing of the tax bucket is, there's only so much that they can take. So at the end of April, the maximum they could have taken in this case was $653, because the March tax bucket was already gone. The April tax bucket was available. So there's all these goofy variables, which this is why we're asking you to just, I know you can't resist. I want to know my numbers too, but it's not helping anybody to say, what is this amount exactly? There's all these goofy little rules. It depends if your tax is being remitted quarterly. It depends on when your date was. It depends when they processed it. What you need to trust here is that you will get your maximum 10% entitlement and we'll report back to you at the end. That's what we're asking you to do, and not everyone will be that patient. I understand that.
How long will we be able to access that income tax bucket once the program ends?
All year. In the extreme, you could choose not to get the money right away. You could have waited till the end of the year and done a calculation and done an adjustment at year end and asked the national payroll folks to give you the money back as part of summarizing your T4. So there's plenty of time to do it, but the amounts are goofy. Like, if I looked at that number, I say, okay, where did they come up with that number? It's in this case, it was the available tax bucket, and it was only one amount, not two. Next slide. Okay, so the common questions, where is my money? So for April processing, if you're on the list and you're not on the exception list, you should be checking your bank. Remember, it isn't going to show up on an ADP report. It isn't coming on an ADP report. It's going to show up in your bank account. What does that amount represent? I'm saying, for the reasons I just explained, trust the system. There's all these goofy rules. In fact, the ones that errored out were because of a goofy rule, and we're just looking at them case by case. Will we get a statement from ADP summarizing? There will be a statement at the end for every pastoral charge. It might end up coming from us, from the General Counsel payroll team, but there will be a reconciliation statement for every pastoral charge that uses ADP and that had transactions of this nature. What should I use for the 75% wage subsidy? Okay, I've been stressing this. Again, the number that you're actually getting may make no sense at all. The number if you chose not to even claim it until year end, the 75% application still assumes that you're going to get it and wants you to subtract it off. So that is why we're saying use 10% of the remuneration that you calculate. That would be the safest way to do it.
Eric, if I could insert there just for a minute, the actual application does say how much are you eligible for, not how much you got or how much you think you should get. It's what are you eligible for. So the 10% is the best way of going.
Absolutely. I've had a number of questions on will the program be extended to? And this is for all the folks that don't quite hit the 30% threshold. I'm betting no, but frankly, I've been wrong a few times over the past 10 weeks. So, if you want to pray or cross your fingers, go for it. But to the extent that the 75% program completely superseded the initial 10% and is intended to replace it, I'm very skeptical. So next slide. And again, if I've tried to answer a few common questions, but if there are any other questions out there, we'll take a pause and then we'll move to the 75% discussion.
Sure. Not seeing a lot of questions about the 10%, but just before we leave the question period and maybe some will come in, Dave Pratt is asking about the CECRA application. That's the rent subsidy one.
Right.
And he says the application requires that we submit a copy of our property tax statement. We don't pay property tax. What do we do there?
Well, you should still, actually, I'm not going to swear by every municipality, but generally you would still get a statement. My churches in Toronto certainly do, and typically there's an MCAP statement, there's a property tax statement from the municipality. If you don't get one, you might want to call your municipality and ask for one. But you might be surprised to find, I was when I was a treasurer at first, that there is such a thing, and the church administrator would just throw it in a folder because no one ever asked for it or did anything with it. Huh. So it probably exists, is my answer.
James says the only statement we've ever seen is the 3-year impact assessment update, nothing from the municipality. Is that what they're looking for?
Well, I think you could use that as well, but it is addressed to you. You could certainly try that, but again, as I say, in the city of Toronto, at least, I know that it is a mailed statement, and most municipalities should be able to give you something. If you try the MCAP statement, it could work, it should work. If there's a notation you could perhaps put on it saying, we don't receive, because of our tax exemption, we don't receive an annual statement, that should help too.
Okay. Evan's asking, did the 10% go back to the beginning of March if our payroll goes out on the 27th?
The 10% has nothing to do with what days your payroll is covering. It was intended to get some money relatively quickly into the hands of charities and small business owners. So it's literally when your payroll was run, that's when you can dip into it. In the extreme, I'm just making this up, but if you paid everyone their annual salary on April 1st, you could take it all at once.
Yeah,
that would definitely be an April Fool's joke, Eric.
That's why that is why I picked the date.
not seeing other questions, so let's carry on.
Okay, so the 75% folks have seen it. This is the list of categories, literally from the federal website. But quite a number of you now have gotten your those of you who have gotten registered have already applied and have gotten your first payments. And so I'm hearing more and more reports of that. It's happening very quickly. Next slide, please. So just a few reminders. Again, this is intended to be a recap for folks who may not have watched the first webinars that are horribly out of date anyway. These are processed at the payroll account or RP number level. So if you have a couple of them, you have to do separate applications for each one, the separate online calculator for each one. If you have some employers on ADP and some not, just how you handle that will depend on what payroll number they're on, whether they have separate numbers. And you then can get more complicated whether your payroll number aligns with your charitable number, but we're going to stay out of that for today. Next slide, please. So the key point for those of you who haven't tried it yet, it is really user-friendly. So I'm not going to go through the whole calculation thing here. Clyde did a great job of this a couple of weeks ago. The slides are still here. The key point, this is actually Clyde's slides. The key point is you have to convert your salaries to weekly and go into the batch tab part of the worksheet. It's an online spreadsheet. It's quite well done, and it's still version 4 after several weeks. So it's finally considered stabilized. So these instructions are for those of you who, if you're struggling, Clyde has laid out a field by field how to do it here. Next slide, please. So again, this is what the spreadsheet looks like, and I threw in 3 names, and I again threw the whole idea of using round numbers. So here we had $1,200 of average weekly pay, so $4,800. You'll see over on the far side the fact that it basically calculates down to the 3/4. It would also calculate the maximums had I put that in. So the spreadsheet does all the heavy lifting for you. You just have to put in your compensation. Next slide. This was a change that just made last week. If you have a weird situation where your salaries from January 1st to March 15th were low because you had people on leave or something, you have the opportunity to swap it out and put in the prior year's information. The point here being, there's a fair bit of latitude. Again, it's a high trust arrangement. You should faithfully put in the best numbers. If you had a custodian away on leave for the first quarter, put their name down and put their 2019 earnings on your spreadsheet. Okay, and the whole idea here is to capture all kinds of situations around seasonal or extended leaves and so on. We do have a number of folks with that kind of situation. I don't think I've got it on a future slide. So let me also mention that if you have someone off on restorative care, we've taken the view that you shouldn't be getting 85% back under the restorative care program and claiming 75% because they remain on salary. We think that the right thing to do there is to limit your claim to 15% of the person's compensation, because you're getting the rest back another way. Otherwise, you'd be getting literally 85% plus 75% in a situation where the person isn't even there. So this is, again, us trying to do it ethically, and even while we're accessing these monies, wanting to take the high road. Next slide, please. So again, Clyde took us through this in considerable detail. The spreadsheet calculates the numbers for you. You print that out and you go back to the web page And you literally, there's an online calculator. You just type in the numbers. You, as it says here, enter the values, and the online calculator will calculate the 4 or 5 numbers that you need. One area that's caused some confusion is the area of what is a furlough. You can actually claim additional benefit here, the employer portion of EI and CPP, which is, in the 6% range. If you are continuing to pay someone fully or partially, and they are to do 0 work. So if you have a custodian who's still checking on the building, or a minister who's going, whatever it is, that isn't a furlough. It may be that had you known about it at the beginning, you might have been more literal about this, but this is intended to cover situations where an employer is continuing to pay folks with 0 expectation of work. Next slide. So this is the 10% business again. If you haven't claimed the 10%, you can do it later, but the system basically says how much are you eligible for, as Clyde mentioned earlier. A key point. Next slide. So from the little worksheet I had before, I had $4,800. This is what the online calculator does for you. First of all, it takes 75%. That's the $3,600. I had 0 because my folks weren't on furlough. I then took 10% of the gross wages off, and that is my CEWS claim. And that is those are the numbers, the very few numbers that I take over to the online application. You basically take those numbers, you say who's the person applying, and who's the boss, if you will, the treasurer or the board chair. It needs to be who's officially responsible for the numbers, particularly if you have an administrator or a representative type person doing the actual filing. So next slide, please. Again, the assumption is that everybody applied. If there's a work sharing program and so on, we haven't heard of that. That's another complication. But when you print the page that we just showed you, and we go to the next slide, you need to be able to get in. So hopefully you're set up for direct deposit. And let me just say this, George Boudreau, I think Cape Breton, if I'm not mistaken, he applied for his on May 1st online. He picked up, the check arrived yesterday. We've been wondering how long it might take by snail mail. The check had a date of May 11th on it. So, but I do know that the government struggles to get things into the mail. So I'm not blaming the Postal Service, but this is one where if he had online, if he had direct deposit with the government, he probably would have gotten his money on the 11th, or probably even earlier, frankly, because electronic payment happens faster than it takes to create a check. Next slide. So there's 3 ways to apply, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. There's the My Business account, there's the representative, and then there's the web access codes. The big news from our perspective here is 2 of my key people, Rose Camborne and Carla Hacker, have volunteered to work with Clyde as a help desk or an advisory service to help people navigate this. And also to help try to straighten out all these weird, unusual situations where you don't know why your payroll number is different from your CRA number, or maybe you don't know what name the CRA has. So we're assembling all the best practices and what has worked. And we created this email address, CRA Help. It's not case sensitive, CRA Help, however you type it, at unitedchurch.ca. And Rose and Carla are going to try to tackle those. They'll reach out to you. In the extreme, we might try to work with you on sharing screens and so on, as you can do on Zoom, so that we can make sure that you're very comfortable with the calculation or what your next steps will be in terms of fixing things with the government. Overall, your goal should be by January 1, 2021 to have fixed these weird number things, because they're only going to, like, it's not going to get better. The world is going online so fast that if you have something that doesn't quite fit, and it should, it is just going to create more work for you. I say the same thing, frankly, about getting people on ADP as opposed to having fragmented payrolls. Next slide, please. So the attestation, you got to learn some of these words. You have to do an attestation, you sound like Donald Trump, everywhere on these. So you're basically saying that you qualify, you're basically saying that you calculated the numbers fairly, that you qualify for revenue reduction, and that you're going to have all these records, okay? There is a chance, a very high chance, that lots of us are going to be audited on this. So you want to have done, err on the side of keeping everything, stating your assumptions, particularly on the revenue threshold test. Okay, if you made some decisions to include or exclude something, document that so it's evident up front. Do not wait for someone to look for it. Next slide.
Before you go, on the previous slide, you were talking about the business representative needing level 2 or level 3. What does that mean?
Over to Clyde.
Clyde, you're muted.
When you become a representative for a client, you have 3 different levels of access with the CRA. Level 3 gives you the maximum amount of access. And level 2 is a fair bit of access, but there's still some activity that you cannot do. And at one point, we thought applying for this subsidy was not going to be available level 2, but they did open it up. So your best bet is, if you're going to apply for it, get level 3.
Okay, and on the next slide, we'll just have a couple of the boxes that you'll typically have to tick. Again, Clyde took us through this, and I've highlighted the ones that are going to be the most relevant to the church. Typically, you're going to have to say, most of you are going to say you're using the cash method. If you're using, there's basically 2 major choices around which reference period. This is the 2019 versus 2020, or whether it's the early part of 2020. And similarly, if you're excluding government funding. So boxes 5, 6, and 7, you're probably going to be ticking, or you might be. And as Clyde has noted, look at the wording of box 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, and 4, because it might apply in multi-point charges, but won't in other settings. And again, you put the amount down. You're not sending this in, but you're having it available. And Clyde is recommending, and I completely agree, that you do one of these for each filing. So if you've applied for March, or the first 4-week period, do all your paperwork for that. Then you're going to automatically qualify for April, but still do the attestation, still do the paperwork. And then when you retest in May, again, have an attestation for each period. Next slide, please.
Just one quick comment. That form does not require a date to be on it. And I think it's best that we put a date on it somewhere near the bottom where it's signed, just so that you know which period you're applying with.
Absolutely. Thank you, Clyde. Yeah. Okay, next slide. So after you apply, online deposits have been within 3 days. Paper checks, now we know, might have taken about 10 days to get a check created, and might have taken some time in the mail as well. But thank you, George Boudreau, for reporting back on that. Want to stress that these monies that you get from the government are not going to count as revenue for your future calculations. They're expressly excluded from that, so you don't have to worry about that. You will have to report them on your T3010 as government grants. And then there's this very goofy thing that we're all wondering how they're going to do it. But they have said that they're going to want to show these amounts on a per staff person on a T4. I have no idea how they're going to do that, but they have said they're going to try. So again, we've got to stress here that we're the church. We try to hold ourselves to a higher standard. So keep the best records you can, and record all your assumptions. Have your attestation paperwork. Basically, assume you're going to be audited, even though we aren't the audience that's going to be subject to the most audits. Next slide, please. I think we're heading towards questions. So the common questions, what wages do I use? I gave you an example there. It's basically base salary, the goofy little taxable life insurance amount, which is usually fives or tens of dollars. If you have some other allowances that are taxable as opposed to reimbursable expense. So if your Con Ed allowance is just an amount as opposed to something that you're claiming on a reimbursement basis. Everything but amounts, basically, that's taxable and that attracts CPP and EI and income tax potentially is to be included. Must I include subsidy amounts received in future eligibility calculations? I've said that already, but no, specifically excluded. What number do I use for the 10% adjustment? And again, can't stress this enough. It's what are you eligible for? So it's basically you're eligible for 10% of that number, as long as you're not blowing through the per employee cap of $13.75. And what if you're not on ADP? Well, this is one situation where if you're all on the same RP number, it doesn't really make all that, you're going to claim it either way with the information that you have, but it's by RP number. If you have multiple RP numbers, you'll have multiple claims for each period. And we know people are asking, do I know anything more about the extension through August? The answer is no. If you check the website today, which I did half an hour before this webinar, still no news. I think there's lots of lobbying going on. But for now, why not assume, dangerous word, that it's going to be very similar. I mean, what are the variables they can play with at this point? It's the income threshold. That's about it, really. So let's see what they come up with. Next slide is going to be any other questions that we haven't covered right there.
And I think you just answered the only question in front of me, which was if the 10% program runs out at the end of June, but the other one carries on to the end of August, then we're not claiming the 10%, obviously, for July and August.
Correct. Again, subject to your maximums, you might still be receiving that 10%, but you probably would have included it in the calculation earlier on. So it would tend to be zero.
But once it's run out, you're not eligible for it. So
yeah.
Oh yeah, so it would be zero because you're not eligible. So yeah. So for the 75% program, question about the free pass here. If I qualified for March and April, then I understand we would automatically get a free pass for May, even if we don't actually qualify?
That is correct.
My question is, to get the free pass, do we apply for May even though we don't actually meet the threshold?
You apply each month to get the amount.
Okay.
The application does not ask anything about whether you had a 30% loss or not. There's nothing there. It's you have to know you're qualified.
Yeah. So and save that paperwork in case you're audited.
That's right.
And remember, again, I don't expect this for us, but the Prime Minister very early on talked about penalties. I mean, this is a high trust claim thing. No one's asking to see these accounting records up front. Okay, so all the people who tell me that their revenues have dropped 26% or 22%, the government isn't going to know unless they audit you. But if they do, they're talking about significant penalties and reputational risk, and there's just plain don't do it. Mm-hmm. Next slide. Or I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut things off. If there are still
Well, that's
questions.
fair. I'm not seeing other questions come up, Eric, so next slide is appropriate.
Okay, so just want to spend a little bit of time on this. The areas that folks are most challenged. I mean, some people are challenged with the technology, and I completely understand that. And we've created this help desk function. But the other part that's a bit wonky is where you have all these situations that don't make sense to the outside world. So if you're a single point charge and your payroll number is different from your charitable number, the CRA has no idea what that means. Like, how could that even be? That's just not how their system works. So there's going to be a whole bunch of areas where you need to basically get yourself aligned to the outside world and the electronic world. So we've talked about signing up for Service Canada. Again, we didn't used to care about Service Canada, but now we're trying to get a record of employment out for impacted staff if there are layoffs. We're trying to do it as quickly as we can. These programs are only available online, so we have to get these accounts set up. And again, as Clyde has covered before, one of the key questions here, however you're approaching this, as a representative or my business account, the best verification the CRA has is they have numbers about you. They know what your tax filings are. They know, so the best way to ask or prove who you are from their perspective is to ask you to provide some information from your own tax return. And that's what you have to do if you set up your own my individual tax account. But there it's logical. All of a sudden they're asking you stuff and you say, hold on a second, I'm just a church volunteer. But it is for the security of the program, and it is data that they have originally. And as Clyde noted before, if you're delinquent in filing tax returns or just haven't had to because you don't owe money, that's going to be a problem. You're going to need to get somebody else to apply for you, because if you can't meet the hurdle of providing the information the CRA asks for to register, you're dead in the water. Next slide, please. So if you haven't heard this often enough yet, you can't hide from this anymore. Like paper filing of all kinds was already going away, but this whole COVID-19 thing has accelerated that, I would say, by 3 or 4 years. It's reasonably straightforward. If you're a single point and your payroll number equals your RP number is your payroll, your RR is your charitable number, your RT is your HST or GST claim, and it's all one number, that works perfectly smoothly. Even if it's frustrating right now to get registered, you'll get registered and you'll be fine. Particularly if you get the level 3 representative access. If your numbers don't make sense, if you've got an RP number that isn't an RR number, and that's quite common in multi-point situations, or if you've been previously registered but no one knows anymore who it was, you're bumping into a whole bunch of CRA security rules. And another one that we talked about earlier is if you've inadvertently delisted your trustees by putting end dates on the annual filing. So we've created CRA help at unitedchurch.ca. Rose and Carla, this is week 1. We've been doing a number of pilot cases with people. Rose and Carla, this is not their first topic area, so they're in training, but they're very, very capable accounting professionals, and they're going to work with Clyde to come up with the best tips, and we'll be publishing little checklists and stuff on how to help those of you who are uncomfortable get into 2020, I guess. Next slide. So this is Clyde's quote from last week. Won't read it to you, other than it's a surprising number. We had one church administrator go look up a bunch of local churches, and they found that 3 out of 10 had made this incredibly stupid mistake. And I'm allowed to say incredibly stupid mistake because my own congregation made it. You don't finish as a trustee or a director. If it says end date, your end date is when you resigned or left the board. Your end date isn't the calendar end of the year. So do not, again, if you did this, you're not alone, but you need to fix it. And one really good way to fix it is to amend the the most current return that you have with the CRA. Okay, Clyde, you were nodding, but that's what you've heard from multiple folks, right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay. So anyway, Clyde gets a quote here in the thing. Next slide, please. We're quite getting towards the end. So please have permission to just do your best here and do try to trust the system. We're used to, managing to the penny and balancing this and that. It's inevitable that there'll be some duplication here. Everything that's going on is new to everyone concerned, whether it's ADP, whether it's the staff team that's working on it here. Oh my goodness, what's this? Oh, it must be around that time.
It is, I know, right?
Yeah, so there's going to be a bunch of reconciliation math activity, arithmetic, sorting this out in the fall, okay? The government isn't going to look at it yet, okay? They're too busy trying to help as many people as they can, whatever one thinks of the risks of the money flowing out right now. They're trying to help us and others keep going when at a time where it'd be very easy to go insolvent or very easy to just close the doors, lay off everybody. So keep books and records. The 10%, you're going to get a reconciliation report in the fall. When it's done, the 75%, you should be keeping records of what you qualify for, because you're going to file that on your T3010. And a mistake here or there is no big deal. It is what it is. I've had people claim or misclaim every single line on the form. It can happen, and as long as it is, there isn't an appearance of fraud, you keep learning and try to fix it on the go. So here's what you need to do. You need to solve the online application challenge. Many of you have solved it already. Okay, you need to process the 10%. You could wait till the end of the year, but you need to go get that. No one's going to give it to you. You have to quote unquote take it. You need to determine if you're eligible for the 75%, and if you are, for which periods. And if you are, then you go through the process and file online by whichever method works, and you keep complete records for each filing. Next slide. So this is getting busier, but I'm going to highlight each of them. First of all, the new service is CRA Helps at unitedchurch.ca. That is going to be, its target is very specifically for getting your accounts going and your numbers sorted out, and getting your immediate wage subsidies therefore processed. But I anticipate that will be available for you for quite some time. Again, I wish you wouldn't, but if you do need to ask about what your amount is on your 10% claim, payroll at United Church, it is Eileen and team that are looking at it. But quite frankly, right now, they've got so much going on that you're literally going to slow things down for everybody with, if the question is, why is it this amount? Okay, there's about 10 reasons, and you don't know half of them, and I don't know half of them. Deferring monthly withdrawal of assessments, again, that's to Assessments United. Suspending church loan programs is to Maria. Stewardship queries is to Dave Jagger. And I also want to say that you folks have been successful. We've been, pushing par payment out there. We're getting more than triple, even with the office closed, and we've got the special arrangements and so on. we're getting more than triple the normal amount of new PAR requests. And we're processing them on a current timely basis. So that's good news. And the information related to that is at the bottom of the page. And again, the church loan program is available on each region website and the national website. So again, this is intended to be a shopping list because Clyde and I are going to take a little time off from our national profile here on Wednesday nights. We will come back immediately if there's stuff to report, but we think we're at the stage where it might be better chasing down individual answers and getting you squared away. Next slide, please.
Before I do, because the next slide is your closer, there's one question here that I think you should address, and it's from Sandy Watson. She says, we asked ADP to stop the automatic 10% calculations so that we can just apply for the 75 directly. Is that a good approach?
Again, no. I think it might actually take on the worksheet, but the spreadsheet very specifically asks you to put how much of the, no, I understand the logic. The logic is, let me go to apply the 75% all in one go. The challenge is it is coming from a government perspective out of two different funding buckets. And the worksheet is specifically asking how much are you eligible for? And you'd in effect be lying, okay, by saying zero, because you're not. So it is tempting, I get that, but it isn't the correct approach.
Oh, James is saying he thinks there's an election on the form to do exactly that.
No.
Yep, I'm happy to have a look at it, but we don't think so.
No.
Good, thank you. Any other questions, folks? This is your last kick at the can for now. So we'll give about 30 seconds to pick up any last questions that are coming in before we show up the final slide. And again, I want to emphasize, we're going to stop the regular Wednesday night programs for now, unless something dramatic happens. And if it does, watch for an email from either United in Learning or through Essentials or something or other. We'll work hard to publicize it, and we'll hold this Wednesday night time slot. But we kind of feel like we're running out of new things to tell you, and we don't want to just drag you out to unnecessarily. So for the 4th to 6th month of the 75% subsidy, we don't know what the reduction in income level would be to qualify.
Correct. We don't know any details yet.
We're assuming it's likely to be the same, but we can't promise that.
We absolutely can't say that.
We know what assume means. It makes, yes.
Yes.
We won't say that on national television, right?
It's still true.
Okay, I'm not seeing other questions coming up, so I think that was a really powerful closing, and I wanted to make sure that you had a chance to frame it properly.
Yeah, well, I think many of you will know of Jennifer Henry, who's the executive director of Kairos. She does I think it's on Twitter, but social media, a weekly prayer, and I'm on her list, and I asked her permission to share this with you because again, for several weeks I was talking about us all being in the same boat. You'll recall last week that that's yet another position that I moved off of. So let me read this tonight. We say we'll get through this, and yet grieve that so many will not. We say we're in this together, and yet know the huge chasms in our experience. We say we'll build back better, and yet feel the tug into familiar, I can't see that, inequity and excess. Creator, be with us. Console us in our losses. Shelter us in our hopes and intentions. Embolden us in our dreams and gestures. Come alongside us as we yearn, confirm, and act towards your holy and beautiful intention of right relations for peoples and our aching wounds and healing our aching wounds. Amen. And let me say that that's what we always try to do, being the church. So thank you, folks. For those of you who follow my sartorial choices, very few of my general counsel office colleagues have seen me in a shirt and tie. So we thought we'd go funky tonight. We will come back at any time when there's new information or interest or demand. But hopefully you found this helpful. Certainly it's been a team effort, learning from many of you as you, in some cases, navigate beautifully, in other cases muddle through. But it's been information sharing the whole way through, and I certainly couldn't have done this without Stephen and Clyde and off-camera Aaron and Kate and others. And so thank you all. Hopefully this has been useful, and we will get through this.
Mhm. So for tomorrow, many of you know we're also running a parallel Thursday afternoon series. Tomorrow's topic is one that many of you might be interested in as well. We're taking a first kick at the can at what's going to be necessary when we start to think about opening our buildings. This could be a while yet, and we may end up opening our buildings for tenants like daycares long before we have worship services in them. But as building owners, as landlords, we have responsibilities for cleaning, for our staff, for the safety of people coming in the building. There are social distancing requirements. We won't be allowed to have as many people in the building as usual, just like you can't in Home Depot. So we're going to take a first run at some of those kinds of questions tomorrow at 3:30 Eastern Time. Your ministers have probably got an invitation to that, but you're certainly welcome to join us too. I'm hoping that we're going to be able to stream that one to YouTube as well, because I suspect we're going to get a larger audience for that. I just need to make sure that I've got a colleague to watch the chat over there as well. Having said that, thank you, friends. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your attention over 10 weeks. Thank you for all of the questions that you've brought and the ways that you've reached out. We have learned so much from your questions. The ministry that you do as finance leaders in your congregation is crucial to our life as a church. You are the ones that make sure that the whole church has the resources to do the ministry that God calls us to, and we're grateful. So thank you for that. I'm going to stop the stream at YouTube. Because of all my surprises tonight, I can't put the leaders into a breakout group, but if you'd like to stay on and debrief with me for a couple of minutes, be glad to do that here in the main room. We'll just invite the people on Zoom to give us some privacy by hanging out quickly. And we will be
That's old school.
again if we need to. Bye for now.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
And the tie goes too.